Here's a sentence that sounds like a typo the first time you read it. A single, free, 1.9 megabyte program built by one unpaid developer has spent the last 4 years quietly wrecking one of Microsoft's most carefully engineered corporate strategies. And as of the newest release this past June, it's still going. That program is called Rufus. And before you dismiss this as some obscure hobbyist tool nobody's actually heard of, sit with this number for a second. Rufus has been downloaded well over 200 million times since its original release back in December 2011. 200 million. That's more people than the entire population of Brazil. It's built by one person, with zero marketing budget, zero corporate backing, and zero revenue model. The developer doesn't even accept donations for his work on it. He actively points people elsewhere instead. And somehow, this tiny, unglamorous piece of software has become the single biggest thorn in the side of Microsoft's plan to retire Windows 10 and force the planet onto new TPM 2.0 equipped hardware. Let's talk about what this program actually is, because the size genuinely matters to this story. Rufus stands for the Reliable USB Formatting Utility with Source, a name so deliberately boring it almost functions as a mission statement on its own. As of the most recent release this June, the entire program weighs in at right around 1.9 megabytes. For comparison, a single photo taken on a modern smartphone is often bigger than that. The tool that's been giving Microsoft's Windows 11 rollout strategy this much trouble is smaller than a picture of your lunch. Here's why that matters. Back in June 2021, when Microsoft first unveiled the hardware requirements for Windows 11, the headline, "Demand was TPM 2.0, a dedicated security chip that Microsoft's own language described as non-negotiable for the future of the operating system." Confident wording. The wording of a company that considered the conversation already closed. The problem was the sheer scale of what non-negotiable actually meant once it hit real hardware. Machines built before roughly 2017 or 2018 frequently either lacked TPM 2.0 entirely or shipped with an earlier version that didn't clear the bar. Microsoft's own compatibility checker, the tool the company released specifically to tell people whether their machines qualified, came back negative for somewhere between 240 and 400 million computers worldwide. Not broken machines, not outdated junk, but computers that ran perfectly well, that manufacturers had certified, that real people had paid real money for and depended on every single day. Microsoft's official guidance for every one of those owners came down to exactly two choices: buy new hardware or stay on Windows 10 until support ran out. A developer named Pete Batard offered a third option nobody at Microsoft had asked for. Within months of the hardware requirements being announced, he built a bypass directly into Rufus, letting Windows 11 install cleanly on machines Microsoft had officially declared unfit to run it. And once that spread, it spread fast, because it turns out an enormous number of people weren't looking for a philosophical argument about planned obsolescence. They just wanted their perfectly good computer to keep working. What's happened since then is a genuinely strange, multi-year, low-grade conflict between one of the most valuable companies on Earth and a single volunteer developer who's never once been sued, never received a cease and desist letter, and has continued shipping fixes faster than Microsoft has ever publicly acknowledged the problem exists. And the most recent chapter of that story isn't ancient history. It happened this year, and Rufus's own changelog from just a few weeks ago quietly confirms the fight is still very much alive. Buried in the June 30th release notes for version 4.15 is a fix for something called CVE 2026-2398, a timing-based vulnerability specifically in Fido, the companion script Rufus uses to pull Windows installation files directly from Microsoft's own servers, bypassing the friction of the official download pages entirely. That's not old news. That's a security patch shipped this summer for a tool that's still, right now, actively locked in the exact same tug-of-war it's been fighting since 2022. So how did a single unpaid developer end up in a years-long standoff with the company that literally builds the operating system his tool is designed to install? And why has Microsoft, a company with essentially unlimited legal and engineering resources, never simply made this problem disappear? That's exactly where this story gets genuinely interesting. And it starts with 3 separate documented collisions between Rufus and Microsoft's own infrastructure, each one patched by a volunteer faster than Microsoft ever formally addressed what happened. Let's walk through this actual timeline, because the pattern here is the entire story, and it's worth seeing it laid out in order. The first real collision landed in August 2022, roughly a year after Windows 11 shipped with its hardware requirements, and about a year after Batard had already built his bypass into Rufus. Microsoft quietly tightened the server-side checks behind its official Windows installation servers. Rufus includes a built-in component called Fido, a script Batard wrote himself that automates pulling installation media directly from Microsoft's own infrastructure, skipping the official download pages and media creation tool entirely. When Microsoft hardened those server checks, Fido broke. Downloads failed. Error codes started appearing for users who'd relied on that shortcut for months. But because Rufus is fully open source, meaning every single line of its code is publicly visible on GitHub, the community of developers watching the project traced the change within days. A contributor figured out the fix. Batard shipped it, and downloads resumed. Microsoft never issued a public statement either confirming or denying what had happened. The second collision was more direct. In October 2024, Microsoft shipped the Windows 11 24.8.2 update, one of the more significant overhauls to the operating system since its original launch, and buried inside it was a change specifically targeting the exact mechanism Rufus had relied on for 3 straight years. A trick involving an empty version of the installer's hardware check file, designed to let the setup process run cleanly without actually verifying whether the machine met the TPM 2.0 bar. With 24.8.2, the installer started detecting that missing check outright, and simply refused to continue. Batard's response arrived within days, this time built around registry modifications that achieved the identical result through a completely different technical route, baked directly into Rufus, applying automatically during installation with 0 extra effort required from the person actually using the tool. The bypass came back online. Microsoft, again, said nothing publicly. The third collision happened this past February, and it's the one that actually made headlines across the tech press, because this time, Batard didn't just quietly ship a fix and move on. He said something pointed publicly on GitHub. Users had started reporting that Fido could no longer pull Windows installation files, hitting a server-side error that looked tied to fraud detection systems on Microsoft's end. Batard posted his read on the situation directly, that Microsoft was detecting the script, something he noted wasn't especially hard to do, given that Fido was fully open source, but that doing so still required active, intentional involvement on Microsoft's part to break specifically. He went further than that, too, floating the idea, in his own words, that Microsoft may have specifically had an employee figure out how to break Fido's downloads and then implemented that on their servers deliberately. That specific line traveled fast. Within days, it had been picked up by PC Gamer, Neoen, Windows Central, and a long list of smaller outlets. Exactly the kind of quote that spreads, because it puts sharp, memorable language on a suspicion a lot of people already quietly carried about how big tech companies steer users toward officially sanctioned paths. Now, here's the part of the story that actually deserves real fairness, because a good faith account of what happened has to include it, rather than smoothing it over for drama. Several outlets that dug deeper into the February incident, including one detailed technical breakdown, found the picture was murkier than a clean, deliberate sabotage story. The specific error people were hitting that week appeared tied to a fraud detection system Microsoft applies broadly across its download infrastructure, including, in some cases, to people downloading directly from Microsoft's own official website, not just through Rufus and Fido specifically. It also disproportionately hit Windows Insider preview builds, which Fido doesn't even attempt to download in the first place, suggesting the Rufus-specific issue and a separate, broader Insider download problem may have been two related, but genuinely distinct incidents that happened to collide on the same error code during the same week, by coincidence rather than design. Batard himself acknowledged that uncertainty in the same GitHub thread, noting plainly that he couldn't actually know for certain what was happening on Microsoft's servers. Microsoft never issued any statement confirming or denying intent either way, and the specific issue was resolved within about a week once another contributor traced the fix. So the honest version of this story isn't Microsoft got caught deliberately sabotaging a beloved open source tool. It's something a little messier and frankly more interesting than that clean narrative. A developer who had personally watched his own tool get broken by Microsoft's infrastructure 3 separate times across 4 years reached a reasonable, if genuinely unproven, conclusion that the pattern had stopped looking like an accident. Whether that specific February incident was intentional or not remains genuinely unresolved. What isn't in dispute at all is the broader pattern underneath it. 3 real, documented, dated collisions since 2022, and 3 separate times where a single unpaid volunteer fixed the problem faster than a $1 trillion company ever formally addressed what had happened on its own servers. And that pattern is exactly why, as of this year, 200 million people have put more trust in a 2 megabyte tool from one developer than in the company that actually built the operating system in the first place. So the real question worth asking isn't really about any single incident. It's structural. Why has Microsoft, with genuinely unlimited legal and engineering resources at its disposal, never simply been able to make this problem go away for good? That answer turns out to be less about any specific fight and more about the fundamental mathematics of what open source actually is, which is exactly where we're headed next. Here's the structural reason this conflict has never resolved cleanly in Microsoft's favor, and it's less about any specific engineering decision and more about basic math that simply doesn't favor the larger company, no matter how much money or talent it can throw at the problem. Rufus is fully open source. Every line of code is public, visible on GitHub to anyone who wants to look at it. Every change Batard makes gets logged, timestamped, and reviewed in the open. That means whenever Microsoft hardens a server endpoint or changes some detail of how the installer behaves, the global community of developers watching the Rufus codebase can spot exactly what changed. Within hours, not weeks. This isn't one person working alone against a corporate engineering team. It's an informal, distributed network of contributors spread across dozens of countries, all capable of noticing a broken pattern and proposing a working fix. Microsoft has to find and permanently close off every possible route someone might use to bypass its hardware checks. Batard and the people around his project only need to find the one route Microsoft happened to miss. That asymmetry doesn't favor the trillion-dollar company. It never really has. And structurally, it's genuinely difficult to see how it ever could, given how the two sides are built. There's a legal dimension underneath all of this, too, and it explains why Microsoft, despite having effectively unlimited legal resources at its disposal, has never once taken direct legal action against Rufus or against Batard personally. Across 4 years of this back and forth, Rufus doesn't distribute Windows. It contains no Microsoft intellectual property inside its own code. It's a formatting utility that helps people create bootable installation media out of Windows files they've already downloaded under a license they already legitimately hold. Microsoft has no copyright claim against a USB formatting tool, and there's no patent covering the general concept of bypassing a hardware compatibility check during an operating system install. On top of that, Rufus is licensed under the GNU General Public License, one of the most deliberately robust, corporate-resistant open-source licenses ever written, mirrored across independent servers worldwide, and maintained by contributors spread across multiple separate legal jurisdictions simultaneously. That's precisely the situation this style of license was designed to create from the outset. Software too legally decentralized to be shut down through litigation, even by a company with Microsoft's resources. Microsoft's own legal team understands this reality, which is exactly why the response across every documented incident has never once been a lawsuit or a formal cease and desist letter. It's been quiet, deniable, purely technical friction instead, hardened server checks, tightened installer behavior, and, according to one developer's public and openly acknowledged suspicion this year, possibly something closer to targeted interference. Now step back from the legal mechanics for a second and look at the actual human scale of who this affects, because the number underneath this entire story deserves its own real attention, rather than getting treated as an abstract market research statistic. Somewhere between 240 and 400 million personal computers worldwide were effectively stranded by Windows 11's hardware requirements. Pick whichever figure feels more conservative to you, and then actually sit with what it represents in practice. A teacher whose school-issued laptop runs everything her students need, but happens to lack a specific security chip nobody told her would eventually matter. A small business owner who built an entire operation around a desktop purchased back in 2016 and has meticulously maintained ever since. A retiree whose computer does everything she actually needs it to do, with zero interest in spending several $100s replacing hardware she was never warned she'd eventually need to replace. A student sharing a family computer that handles coursework and job applications without a single functional problem, right up until a compatibility checker appeared on screen and declared the family's machine no longer good enough. Multiply stories like that across hundreds of millions of households, and you start to understand what this hardware requirement actually did at a genuinely human scale. Not as a market transition statistic in a slide deck, but as a real access problem that landed hardest on the people least equipped to absorb its cost. And the pressure behind all of this got sharper, not softer, once Windows 10 itself reached the end of its mainstream support life back in October 2025. For every one of those hundreds of millions of stranded machines, that date turned a soft preference into something a lot closer to an ultimatum. The computer people were using every single day, the one that turned on every morning and did everything asked of it, simply stopped receiving new security patches. Full stop. Every vulnerability discovered from that point onward wouldn't get fixed on that specific machine unless the owner specifically enrolled in Microsoft's extended update program, which, even with a surprise extension announced this past June, pushing free consumer coverage out to October 2027, is still explicitly framed as a temporary bridge toward eventually buying new hardware, not a permanent reprieve from the underlying problem. For a meaningful share of the people caught in that gap, the internet handed them an answer almost immediately, and it wasn't some obscure command line trick reserved for hobbyists. Rufus has a genuinely simple graphical interface. It asks plain language questions. You plug in a USB drive, open the program, pick a few options, and it handles the rest. no registry editing or terminal knowledge required at any point. That accessibility is exactly why the tool's user base expanded well beyond the technically sophisticated crowd that originally adopted it back in 2021 and moved into genuinely mainstream territory in the months surrounding Windows 10's actual end-of-support date. A perfectly capable laptop with a solid processor and plenty of memory, declared incompatible purely because it lacked a chip it was never designed to include in the first place, and a family deciding that buying costly new hardware just to satisfy that single requirement felt wasteful when the machine they already owned did everything they actually needed it to do. So, let's pull back now and ask the bigger question, sitting underneath everything we've walked through, because it's genuinely larger than any single technical detail or download statistic. And it's exactly where I want to close this story out. So here's the actual question sitting underneath this entire story, and it's bigger than Rufus, bigger than Microsoft, and bigger than any single CVE patched in a June changelog. In an era where technology companies are larger, wealthier, and more deeply woven into daily life than at any previous point in history, who actually controls the computer sitting in front of you? Not in some abstract philosophical sense, in the practical, everyday sense. When you power on a machine you paid for, running an operating system you licensed, who's actually making the call about what you're allowed to do with hardware you own? Pete Batard's own answer to that question comes through less in interviews or manifestos and more in roughly a decade and a half of consistent, unpaid work. His GitHub profile describes him simply as a free software developer. No corporate affiliation, no monetization strategy, no venture backing behind any of it. He doesn't even accept direct donations for his work on Rufus specifically, pointing supporters instead toward the Free Software Foundation, the organization built around the principle that users deserve the right to run, study, modify, and share the software they depend on. For most of the last 3 decades, that philosophy mostly lived inside academic circles and niche developer communities, rarely intersecting with how ordinary people actually experience their computers day to day. It's now intersecting directly with the lived experience of hundreds of millions of people who never had the slightest interest in software philosophy, but who've personally felt what it's like to be told by a company that their perfectly functional hardware is no longer permitted to run the operating system they've depended on for years. Philosophy becomes relevant fast once it starts describing your actual situation, and right now it's describing the actual situation of a genuinely enormous number of people at once. It's worth being fair to the fuller picture one more time before wrapping this up, because a story this widely shared deserves a level-headed accounting rather than a purely one-sided one. Microsoft has never issued a lawsuit, a cease and desist letter, or any formal legal action against Rufus, or against Batard personally, across 4 full years of this back and forth. And that restraint on its own is genuinely worth noting rather than skipping past. The company has also never publicly confirmed intentional sabotage of FIDO specifically, and as we covered earlier, the most recent widely reported incident carries real, documented ambiguity about whether it reflected a targeted block or simply an unfortunate collision with a broader fraud detection system Microsoft applies across its download infrastructure generally. Batard himself, to his credit, has consistently stopped short of stating his suspicion as confirmed fact, framing it instead as his own reasonable read of a now familiar pattern rather than something he can actually prove. That distinction matters, and any responsible telling of this story keeps it intact rather than flattening it into a cleaner, more dramatic version than the evidence actually supports. But here's what isn't ambiguous at all, and it's really the core of why this story keeps resurfacing across tech press, Reddit threads, and comment sections in a dozen languages every time a new chapter gets added to it. 3 separate, well-documented collisions between Rufus and Microsoft's infrastructure since 2022. 3 separate times, an unpaid volunteer fixed the resulting problem faster than a trillion-dollar company ever formally addressed what had happened. And a security patch shipped as recently as this past June, closing a real vulnerability in the exact same download mechanism that's been at the center of this fight the entire time. Proof that whatever this relationship actually is, it hasn't cooled off and it hasn't gone away. None of the underlying pressure that drove people toward Rufus in the first place has actually eased either, and that's really the through line, connecting this story to everything else happening across the PC industry heading into the back half of 2026. The hardware wall Windows 11 put up is still standing exactly where it was. The population of stranded, perfectly functional machines, somewhere between 240 and 400 million of them, hasn't meaningfully shrunk. Windows 10 support has already ended, and even Microsoft's own extended security update program, generous as this year's surprise extension through October 2027 genuinely turned out to be, remains explicitly framed as a bridge toward eventually buying new hardware, not a permanent solution to the underlying incompatibility. As long as those structural pressures stay exactly where they are, a free, open source, 1.9 megabyte tool that lets people keep using computers they already own is going to keep finding new users. And every time Microsoft's infrastructure changes in a way that happens to break it, however intentional or coincidental that change turns out to be, the story is going to keep writing itself in almost exactly the same shape it has for the past 4 years. So here's the honest question worth actually sitting with before you go. Does it matter, in any practical sense, whether Microsoft deliberately targeted FIDO during any one specific incident, or does the deeper story here matter more? Hundreds of millions of working computers declared obsolete by a single corporate decision, and one unpaid developer, over and over, quietly building the door back open every single time it gets locked. Tell me honestly in the comments which side of that question you land on. And if you've personally used Rufus to keep an older machine running Windows 11, or made the jump to Linux instead once your hardware got locked out, I genuinely want to know which path you took and why. That's the kind of real lived data point no press release from either side is ever going to give you. If this breakdown helped you see the fuller, more complicated shape of a story that's mostly been told through one-sided headlines, subscribe, because between whatever Microsoft's infrastructure does next, Batard's next release, and the slow-motion fallout of Windows 10's extended support window, this is very much a story that's still being written. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.